Welcome to the Diefenbunker's Cold War Speaker Series. This is our first event in this year's series where we hear lectures and talks given by guests on Cold War themes, both within Canada and around the world. My name is Sean Campbell, and I'm the curator here at the Diefenbunker Canada's Cold War Museum, and will be the moderator for this evening's event. We have a special event this evening. In recognition of Pride Month here in Canada's capital, we have gathered a panel of presentations to talk about the history of the LGBT Purge, one of the least commonly acknowledged aspects of Canada's Cold War history into mainstream discourse until recently. To help tell the story, we have several guests from two prominent organizations to walk through this history from an overview and then personal perspectives: the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg and the Rainbow Veterans of Canada. As a note, this is a virtual event as part of a collaboration with the Mississippi Valley Textile Museum in Almonte, Ontario, just down the road from our museum. We will be presenting an on-site, in-person event on the history of the Purge with a different set of speakers and a screening of the award-winning documentary, The Fruit Machine. If you are in the area, we highly recommend going out to support the museum and the event. We would like to thank them for collaborating with us to bring this history to the area for the public to learn about. Details will be shared later in the presentation. We have program interpreter Emily Gardner and curator historian Scott de Groot from the Canadian Museum for Human Rights to discuss the museum's Governor General Award-winning exhibition, Love in a Dangerous Time, Canada's LGBT Purge, the largest exhibition on queer history and 2S LGBTQ+ activism ever produced by a Canadian museum. Emily Gartner is a program interpreter at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, a seasoned museum professional who is passionate about museum education. Emily has worked at several museums throughout Manitoba and is currently completing a master's degree in museum education through the University of British Columbia. Scott de Groot holds a PhD from Queen's University and specializes in the history of sexuality and gender, public history and heritage, and 2S LGBTQ+ activism. He is an associate of the Wilson Institute for Canadian History at McMaster University and teaches in the Human Rights Program at Global College, University of Winnipeg. For their personal perspectives on the panel, we have three survivors of Canada's LGBT Purge who are members of the Rainbow Veterans of Canada. Jen Laird was born into a military family and grew up on a farm in rural Ontario with her parents and three brothers. After graduating high school in 1980, she immediately enlisted in the military. However, it wasn't until 1983 that an opening finally became available for military police. She finished her basic training in Cornwallis and went to CFB Borden for MP training, excelling in all courses, and was set to graduate at the top of her class. She was purged in April of 1984 with a diagnosis of homosexuality. Jen kept the secret shame to herself until 2019. Today, Jen lives in Ottawa with her partner of 20 years and their two spoiled cats, Kevin and Stuart. Danny MacKinnon grew up in the Halifax area where he first enrolled in the militia during high school. Joining the regular force as an administration clerk for 10 years, he was purged while posted to the Canadian Defence Liaison Staff in London, England. After 18 years of different education and careers, he returned to the Canadian Armed Forces, completing 25 years before retiring in the Ottawa area with his husband and their dogs. Gloria Dawn Halvorsen is a St. John, New Brunswick-based musician, sound engineer, and human rights advocate dedicated to creating positive community change. As a Royal Canadian Navy veteran from 1984 to 1987 and member of the Rainbow Veterans of Canada, she works to raise awareness about the LGBT Purge. Her trailblazing advocacy for trans rights includes serving as a delegate to the Canadian Human Rights Commission Roundtable and speaking at institutions like Dalhousie Medical School and the UNB Faculty of Law. We would like to thank both organizations and our guests this evening for participating in this virtual event. I would now like to welcome Emily Gartner, live from Winnipeg, to walk us through Love in a Dangerous Time. The floor is yours.
Just the floor? I get the ceiling too? All right, excellent. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the introduction, Sean. Really happy to show you all today our wonderful exhibit here at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. I expect that there are likely people watching who have been to the museum before. In fact, I know there are a couple of people I work with who are on this call, including Scott. And I only hope to do justice to this space here that's really incredible and has had so many hands from so many different people, both at the museum and part of the Rainbow Veterans, who have been involved in its creation and its continued existence. So we're really excited to show you it, and I'm really excited to show you around. As you're going through this exhibit with me, please do not hesitate to put questions in the chat. Diefenbunker can pass them along to us. We also have a moderator from the CMHR available too. So please do ask. I will do my best to answer. And if I cannot answer, that's why we have Scott. So you will get to hear from him later. Alrighty. So without further ado, I would like to welcome you all. I'm now big on my screen. Hey, and flip the camera around. Oop. Welcome for the first time for many of you to this space. We are located here at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg, Manitoba. We are on ancestral lands here at the Forks, Treaty Number 1 territory, homeland of the Innuit, Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, Dene, and Dakota peoples, as well as the Red River Métis. We are part of the history of this land, and we are part of the history of this land that we now call Canada. And this is part of Canada's story. Welcome to Love in a Dangerous Time, all about Canada's LGBT Purge. So before we begin, I'd like us to consider a few different things. First of all, the importance of having this exhibit in this museum here. This museum talks about human rights, but not just human rights as a concept. We wanted you to think about how human rights relate to you, how they exist in your life, how you understand them to be, and how them existing, being protected, and being taken away might affect you and those around you. And so my hope is that you'll go through this with the ability to reflect on what you're hearing about, both from me and later from our wonderful panelists. And I want you to consider how you will carry forward these stories and what sorts of conversations you can have. To help guide us in that, I like starting with these questions right here that are, I think, quite excellent, that they put at the beginning of this exhibition here. The first one is, what does it mean to be normal? And how do ideas about normality change over time? Consider what is normal to you. What parts of your identity are real for you, that are very everyday for you, might be very different to other people. And consider what our society would call normal and whether or not that really exists. Next, who is harmed or excluded by national security policies? National security for whom? If we think about, as we're probably going to be doing quite a lot today, and if you are going to Diefenbunker, you're definitely thinking about times in our history where national security is considered absolutely paramount in Canada. How do our policies affect our day-to-day lives? And if they're not affecting our day-to-day lives, does that mean that we ignore or avoid conversations or questions about how they're affecting others? And finally, are you being watched or recorded? Is your privacy protected in the digital age? I mean, the answer to this is no, your privacy is not being protected. And yes, if you have a cell phone, you are being recorded. Case in point, I'm literally being recorded right now. But I want you to think about all of the ways that you're being watched, tracked, and followed, and how much your right to privacy is something that is a little bit more elastic today than it would have been considered to be in the past. All of these questions play a role in this exhibition. And so as we begin this journey, I want you to keep thinking about these ideas: normality, security, privacy. Identity, security, and privacy are all human rights. So we begin our story in this little hall here that I keep showing you. This is all about Canada prior to the Purge. And it is worth noting that in order to talk about the origins of the Purge, we have to talk about the origins of the 2S LGBTQ community in this land we now call Canada. And of course, these origins date back as long as there have been people here. And so they've existed forever. We have queer Indigenous history that dates back thousands of years, that transcends all kinds of different ideas that we have that come from our colonial context. Different identities, different perspectives, and even different words for queer people and queer identities have been recorded in cultures all across North America. And these identities are not new, and they are found all over. Now, it's worth noting that a lot of Indigenous cultures and communities did not have any issues with queer people, that queer people were often central parts of their communities and their societies, that they were welcomed and celebrated. There's no one way that Indigenous cultures or communities approached queer people because, quite frankly, Indigenous cultures and communities are all very different from one another in a lot of ways. But consistently, what is the case is however they were treated in their own cultures and communities, that shifted with colonization, particularly with the introduction of Christianity. So I don't know if you've ever seen this painting before, but it is quite well known in many circles. And I have to say, as morbid as it is one of my favorites. This is Kent Monkman's The Scream. It's a reproduction of it from 2017. That's back when he painted it. And it is this very visceral representation of the horror of not just residential schools, but colonization in general. You have these images of these priests and nuns ripping Indigenous children away from their families, away from their mothers and their aunties, and taking them away. Kids trying to flee and being unable to, in some cases. For me, when I look at this and when I think about the story of residential schools, I think oftentimes about the way people were treated, but also about the rights that were taken from them, what they had to give up in these schools, what they were forced to leave. And one thing that you won't see the same way you can see people, children in your head going without food or going without their cultural clothing or going without their families. One thing you won't see is sometimes these children lost their ability to express their identities and themselves. And a lot of that was cultural, but in many cases it was a gender identity or a sexual orientation. And that was lost with the introduction of Christianity and the introduction of Canadian law. You see, Canadian law is based in French and English tradition. And starting in the 1600s, with the first colonies being established in New France, there was the introduction of many of the laws that existed already over in Europe that were based in Christian principles connected to biblical interpretations that stated that queer identities were a sin. So we have this map here of the city of Montreal as a colony of New France in 1645 right here. At the time, they wouldn't have used necessarily the same words that we use today to talk about queer people. They would have used terms such as sodomy or buggery in British traditions in particular, talking about how being queer, especially having sex between two men, was a crime. And this was punishable. And in many cases, as police forces arose to govern this colony and other colonies that would follow it on this land, there were new ways of sort of looking for and persecuting people who were queer. So you have this ladder leant up against the side of a building here. There would be morality squads in police services in the early 1900s that would try and gather evidence of people who were queer, even by looking into homes and safe spaces to see where two people, particularly men, might be meeting. And so with this introduction of this colonial government and the following forms of governance that would come through, there was this understanding that being queer was a crime. And it was in many ways seen as despicable by the broader society. But it didn't mean that queer people didn't exist. Case in point, we have our Times of War section here. Now, it's worth noting that during the World Wars, if you were caught as a soldier in a same-sex relationship of any kind, you could be arrested, detained, and you would likely be discharged and expelled for committing a homosexual act. But for many people who were joining the military, particularly in the First and Second World Wars, a lot of them were finding themselves in a close quarters, often same-sex environment with lots of people coming from far off and afield communities for the first time ever. And so it was easier for queer people to find and make connections than they might have found if they were still living in tiny towns off on their own. And so there was a much, much greater chance of forming these attachments, especially with the kind of trust and comradeship that the Army engendered. But it didn't mean there weren't massive risks. So we have this fellow here, Ross Hamilton, also known as Marjorie. I'm going to use Ross and Marjorie interchangeably here because we're not entirely sure about the name. Hamilton was expelled from the military for reasons other than medical. Hamilton had been a part of a troupe of female impersonators during the First World War and had been an ambulance driver during the day and part of this troupe in the spare time. Once discovered to be gay, Hamilton was discharged. But we do know that Hamilton existed and continued on with this, with their identity and expressing themselves. We have a bracelet from the 1920s and 30s that belonged to Marjorie next to a uniform, because both can exist in a person. So eventually the Second World War did end, and these policies around the military shifted as time changed, and the Cold War began as we moved from hot to cold. And so that leads us into this section here, the beginning of the purge formally. So keep in your head, we have had a period of time that has lasted hundreds of years where the government in Canada has seen people who are queer as committing crimes, especially queer men, and they have continuously persecuted those found to be queer. But it wasn't as formalized in many regards as the purge would become. So after the Second World War, in the 1940s, we see the divisions begin to grow between NATO countries and the Warsaw Pact countries. As you can see here outlined on this map, my diefenbunker friends are probably going, this is going to be good, and I'm going to say this is going to be the shortest summary of the Cold War possible. Apologies. But in the short, we have on one side the US, Canada, and other NATO allies who represent one way of seeing the world, one way of politically existing within it. And then on the other side, there's the Soviet Union and their allies. We have these two sides of a growing conflict, and there is a lot of fear and concern that had already been existing for decades at this point between which side would become the dominant world order. And then, as the war was ending, the Second World War was ending, we began to see more and more evidence of Soviet espionage in the West. And so we have this gentleman here with a bag over his head. This is Igor Gouzenko. He's at a radio station giving an interview in 1968. He had defected as a clerk at the Soviet embassy. He had defected in Ottawa in 1945. He was our first proof, well, not first proof, but significant proof that Soviet agents were operating in Canada, and there were informants around the government ranks. And so the political leaders in Canada and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police started to get very, very nervous and very, very touchy. And this was reflected by what was going on in the States too. You have here a lovely picture of Senator Joseph McCarthy and President Dwight D. Eisenhower. These two gentlemen are heavily associated in our media and in our culture with the Red Scare and with the idea that there are communists lurking in every corner. And so the government of Canada, not wanting to lose defensive contracts with the US and also being concerned for its own national security, started to consider where to look for spies. Now, I often ask kids when showing them around this gallery a very simple question. What would make you betray your country? Simple, right? And the kids often talk about lots of money or maybe not liking their country or agreeing with it. But eventually they all land up with the idea of blackmail, fear, concern. And this is very connected to what would become the purge. The government started looking for groups of people who were people with secrets that they wouldn't want exposed, who might be seen as easy to blackmail, and who might have negative feelings towards their government for maybe laws that were in place that weren't all that pleasant to them. They started looking for people who were likely to become spies through carrots and sticks. And a big group of people that they started to think about were queer people, because they saw this idea that if somebody was queer, they must be hiding that they are. And if the Soviets found out, they could be outed. And so they'll do whatever it takes to hide this secret. And so in the late 1940s into the 1950s, the government, sorry, there it goes. governments started putting together a whole bunch of policies. We have this wall of paper here, and these are all copies of different policies and memos and the physical evidence of the purge, of all these things that went out through the civil service and the RCMP, saying that if there are queer people who work in these with high security clearances, they need to be found and they need to be interrogated and they need to be removed because we cannot trust them to be loyal. And so the government started working with the RCMP to track down people who were queer. So how this would work is like any sort of police investigation at the time in a lot of ways. They would look for evidence that somebody was queer, they would follow them to confirm, and then they would arrest them, bring them in for questioning, and eventually they would face the consequence of their identity. It shouldn't be a consequence at all, but anyways, modern sensibilities. We have here our categories of exclusion. So the RCMP investigations, they look for evidence to move someone from being an alleged homosexual who had maybe been named in the past by somebody else who had been confirmed, or maybe they had some sort of evidence of other kind that they were likely homosexual. Suspected someone was someone with credible belief that that person was a homosexual, but they hadn't absolutely been sure of it yet. And then confirmed with somebody who had either admitted their sexuality or they'd been convicted of a related crime. So this is somebody that they were absolutely certain of. The idea was to figure out who among the alleged homosexuals could be confirmed later on. And they would do that using all kinds of things. They would interrogate neighbors and family members. They would follow people and spy on them. They would track them to their homes. They would do all kinds of things. And inevitably, it would culminate often with an interrogation and with firing. So that happened to, for example, this gentleman here, we have David Nixon, who worked for the Department of External Affairs in the 1950s. In 1961, he was recalled to Ottawa and pressured to resign after being interrogated. He actually wound up going through what we would consider conversion therapy at the time after the fact, with a lot of electroshock therapy used on him and experimental drugs. It was a very abusive situation later on to try and change who he was. He later came out the other side of it and has since shared his story. This is a picture of him and his partner back in 2004. During his time in the civil service, he actually took a lot of pictures. He had quite the career and he was good at his job. And that was the thing. A lot of people were very good at their jobs and very proud of them, proud of the work that they did, proud to serve their country, proud of who they were. And while there shouldn't have necessarily been a conflict between who someone was and how they served their country and who they loved and how they expressed themselves, the government found ways to find this wrong. And that was in line with broader society. We get back to that idea of normality, thinking about that ideas of who's normal. Are you normal? After the Second World War ended, especially getting into the 1950s, there was a huge amount of emphasis placed on gender roles, on who was right and who was wrong, being based on what role you played in that nuclear family image. We have this advertisement here for the Bissell sweeper: saves time, saves work, saves drugs, saves you. And we have this image here of this perfectly polished housewife with her perfectly pajamaed spouse and her little girl already learning the ropes of how to be a lady. The idea is you should fit into gender roles, that this was the ideal, and that these were the things that everyone should aspire to be. And so anything that would maybe push people, especially kids, out of these roles was considered to be dangerous and damaging. And that included anything that might promote queer culture or support queer people or be any form of queer expressionism. So for example, you may have heard over time about pulp novels that were really popular, that were sent around, that were queer novels. These were oftentimes monitored and banned in many, many cases, and they wouldn't be sold and they'd be hidden away. The idea is you're keeping kids safe, you're keeping society safe from these things that would seek to corrupt us. And if we have these ideas about what's normal, then we also have these ideas about what's not, what doesn't belong. And if we're able to understand what doesn't belong, then that makes it maybe potentially theoretically able to be tracked and found out and discarded without having to do all of the expense of interrogating everyone. So that leads us into the 1960s. So in the late 50s and into the 60s, there's as a part of this huge surge of pseudoscience that came up and psychiatry. Canada began to follow along this trend and see an opportunity. Why spend all this money and time and manpower on the RCMP going and interrogating people and following them around when we could just develop a test to determine if somebody was queer and didn't belong in the civil service? And so they developed the fruit machine, or well, more specifically, this guy did. This is F.R. Wake, Dr. F.R. Wake. He's from Carleton College, and he was tapped by the government to develop a battery of tests that would do things like measure your pupillary response to lewd images, or a whole bunch of questions that you were supposed to respond to, or words that would cause you to have like this huge moment of like sexual panic. And they could use these questions, images, and words to track somebody's reactions and determine if they were queer. So, for example, we got a couple of things from the test here. True or false? I want you to consider answering this in your own mind. I like mechanics magazines. Well, do you like mechanics magazines? True or false? I don't particularly, but that's just me. True or false? I think I would like the work of a dress designer. This I think I'd like more because I am very into embroidery. Now, do either of these things have to do with my identity in any way, shape, or form, or whether I'm queer or straight or anything like that? No, but you can see how clearly these are aligned with historic gender roles, and how the idea about men liking big machines and women liking frilly dresses would have been seen to be good indicators of somebody who was against the norm, against the grain. Like, how dare you be a man who wants to design dresses, or a woman who thinks the inner workings of a car are interesting, like the carburetor. I don't drive. Anyways, but all of this was a huge test that was used. It was used on hundreds of employees across the civil service, and it did not work. It did not work at all. It's actually been quite a fascinating thing in pop culture recently. We've talked quite a bit about the fruit machine. There's actually a really great film about it that I believe is being screened by a certain museum that may or may not be involved in what we're doing tonight. Anyways, it's worth checking out. But yeah, eventually in the 1960s, the project was determined to be a failure. In 67, it was shut down. It didn't really work because, of course, traditional historic gender roles have absolutely nothing to do with whether or not somebody is queer. And so instead, the government went back to what they previously were doing, which was spying on people. So I'm moving into one of my favorite places in this exhibit. It is our bar. I want you to think for a moment about your favorite place to hang out. Do you have a coffee shop that you like to go to in the mornings, on the weekends? Do you have a bar you like to go hang out in, or a pub? Is there a favorite restaurant that you make the time and the money to go to once a season to spend time? Or is there somebody's house that you consider the group hangout spot? Think about the community spaces that exist for you and how special and important they are. I have a coffee shop down where I live called Little Sister. That's what I tend to think about. I go there once a week before I go and, put myself through grocery shopping. So this bar right here is not just a random bar that we're putting in here. This is actually a replica of the bar in this space, the Lord Elgin Hotel. Ottawans, take note, you will be more familiar with this than me. I don't think I've ever seen the Lord Elgin in my life, but I've seen lots of pictures, and it's a beautiful hotel. And it has in it a bar. And that bar was one of the points on this map here. This map tracks queer spaces in Ottawa. These are all spaces that would have been known to the RCMP and to the military as being locations where queer people would meet up to meet other people who were like them. You see, if you are looking for people who are like you, maybe to form relationships, maybe to just make friends, maybe for a casual encounter of some kind. You would have to go and look for people in spots that were known to be places where other queer people hung out. And these places, in order to be places that queer people could find, had to be known. And so it was relatively quick that the RCMP began marking down where homosexual activity was taking place in Ottawa. Except it became a really futile activity because really fast they found that there were a ton of spaces like that. Like, this map is very conservative. There are lots and lots of spots in Ottawa that they found queer people hung out. And oftentimes house parties were really common, especially for lesbians and women who were queer. But I digress. We have this space here as an example of one such space. Now, if the RCMP knows where queer people often go to hang out, then they can go hang out there too. After all, a lot of these are public spaces, if not all. And if they're able to hang out in these public spaces, they can start keeping watch. Who goes in? Who comes out? Who are they with? Do they work for the government? What department do they work for? Do you think that they might know our secrets? Do you think they've already turned on us? Are they a spy in the making? Now, queer people didn't take this lying down. They knew they were being observed. And this was part of broader circumstances around like police raids and things like that were very, very common in the 50s and 60s and carried on for quite some time. And there were signals that were developed by queer people to try and hide or alert people when cops were coming and so on. But the goal with the RCMP was to try and identify as many homosexual people as possible. And so they started talking to people who were known in the queer community. So for example, we have Paul Fournier here, also known as Peaches Latour. And Paul, as Peaches, was extremely well known in the queer community and was dragged into questioning by the RCMP at one point. The RCMP called him a traitor to his country and asked him to tell them who are the civil servants going to his drag shows. And Paul didn't give names. So the RCMP threatened to out him as gay. And that didn't work because Paul was already out. So he gave up no names. He kept it really quiet. And a lot of people in the queer community very bravely kept names to themselves. They did not share who was queer. They did not try and give up names to save themselves or anything like that. But of course, it's not always consistently true. And the RCMP had lots of ways of gathering information, lots. And this method of spying did lead to people getting caught and getting arrested and losing their job. So for example, we have here this gentleman, Dave Van Norman, who was part of the RCMP. You see, eventually the RCMP turned this all inward in the 1950s and 60s. And Dave started with the RCMP in 1947, was heavily involved in their presence in the North, wrote quite a bit about his experiences up there, speaking about Inuit communities and so on. And then he was caught in 1964 while on leave in Ottawa, coming out of the Lord Elgin. So he was investigated and fired, despite a stellar track record of 17 years. And there are even more tragic cases. This gentleman here on the left, this is John Watkins. He's the Soviet ambassador for Canada. He's Canada's ambassador to the Soviet Union, to be clear. And of course, you might recognize he's standing with Lester B. Pearson, Canada's Prime Minister. Watkins was an extremely successful ambassador, and he was navigating a lot of that relationship in the 1950s when things were very tense between the West and Soviets. And because of that, he was being watched. Russian intelligence officers actually eventually photographed him with a male lover in Moscow. And they used it to try to blackmail him into spying for them. But Watkins wouldn't break. He did not spy. He did not betray Canada or NATO. And he went and told them what happened, and NATO investigated John. They asked him about it. There were investigations that involved interrogations in London and Paris. And these agencies that investigated him really wanted to be certain that he wasn't a traitor. And so they pushed and they pushed and they pushed. And then finally, when he was back in Montreal, undergoing even more questioning. He suffered chest pains that turned out to be a heart attack. He was ignored by our CMP officers and died in custody. He was literally interrogated to death. This was an incredibly traumatic time period for thousands of people across Canada. The numbers and the names, many of them are still unknown to us because, quite frankly, it was an extensive system that lasted for a long time. And the civil service and the RCMP are early examples and adopters of the purge, but the military was also heavily involved in this. And then in the 1970s, as the purge started to wind down for the civil service, it started to wind up in the armed forces. So 1970s rolls around and we see a huge surge in queer rights movements. We've got a great photo here, protesters at Pride Week in Toronto. In 1973, look at those awesome 1973 outfits. If you were alive in 1973, please enjoy these war flashbacks to a time of your life where there was a lot of plaid. Apologies, that probably wasn't very good language on my part. Anyways, moving on. Over here, we have a directive from External Affairs showing the kind of inconsistency that came up in the civil service in the 1970s. There was more lenient treatment from queer civil servants in some cases, but it really depended on the department and who you worked for. With the decriminalization of queer acts in the 60s by the Canadian government, people were no longer being arrested for being queer, and so there was less persecution, but you could still be passed over for promotions, you could still be treated poorly, you could have security clearance being excluded for you, all kinds of things. This was still an issue. And then the armed forces in the 70s and 80s really started to look into queerness, especially for women. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a huge surge of women beginning to enter the workforce. And by the time the 80s rolled around, there was more women in the workforce than ever before. And because of these fears around queer people existing in these spaces, there started to be directives in place about investigating those who were considered different or not normal. So we have this administrative order from the armed forces from 1967 stating how to determine if someone is queer and how that should be handled by their superiors. They started looking around using the Special Investigations Unit to figure out who was queer and who wasn't. And so anybody who was different than what would be perceived to be their proper gender roles would be harassed, investigated, and ultimately discharged. And this could mean any number of things might be seen as different about you. But for women, ironically, one of the things that was different about them is wanting to join the army rather than stay at home and have children. This was already something that many people saw as being odd or maybe an indication of queerness. And so many, many people started being watched. So we have here this image of a K car right here. That nice Reliant automobile was used by the Special Investigations Unit and is actually a part of a lot of people's harder and sadder stories around the purge. Because suddenly outside of your home and outside of the spaces you frequented, there would be a car watching you. Everywhere you went, watching to gather evidence. Some purge survivors talk about how this was an indication to them that they may have been caught and that interrogation and discharge was on the way. So I want you to think back to that sort of safe space that you were thinking about earlier. The coffee shop, the bar, the restaurant, friend's place, whatever it is. And I want you to imagine somebody watching you go in and out, in and out, in and out. In a car all the time. And think about how safe you feel as national security worth your personal security. So now this space here is our dark room. It's our interrogation space. If at any point you need a break, please do feel free to take one. This space right here is where people would be brought, or is a replica of some of the spaces where people would be brought to be questioned. In a lot of ways, this is quite stereotypical. It's got the soundproof walls, the one-way glass, the table with, well, there's one chair on either side of it, but really there should be two chairs on this side. And the information is not in two places, it's just in one. You're pulled in for questioning. Sometimes you don't even know what about. And there will be people asking you questions, personal questions, intense questions. When the exhibit opened, a Purge survivor told me that he was in an interrogation. He thought he was just getting more clearance during his time in the Air Force ahead of promotion. And the investigators sitting across from him started out with normal questions. They talked and talked and talked for 30 minutes. And then all of a sudden the question shifted. Personal question. Are you gay? Is this person gay? Have you met this person before? Have you slept with them? Do you know this? Do you know them? Are they gay too? On and on and on. And it didn't matter what he said or how he denied it. Their minds were made up. The evidence was there. And ultimately, he was fired. He told me this was the worst part about his experience. And I think that might be true of a lot of people. He also showed this to me. So the gentleman's name was Stephen Deschamps that I spoke to. He showed me this here. This is his Air Cadet uniform. And if anybody's ever been in cadets, you'll know this is an organization for teenagers where they get to be a part of an organization. It's kind of similar to scouting, but it's a paramilitary group where you're learning about how to be in the armed forces and transferring some of those systems and beliefs to you early. It's a great way if you're planning on joining the armed forces later on as an adult to get into it when you're young. And particularly for air cadets, it's an opportunity to fly. I want you to think about when you were 16 or even younger, 12, 8, 4. What did you want to be when you grew up? Did you have a dream? What was your plan? No, when I was a kid, I didn't really have a plan. I wanted to be a dozen things between now and breakfast. But I do remember a friend of mine having a really clear dream, wanting to be in theater, wanting to be on the stage, and how she worked so hard for it, all the hours she spent on it. It was her dream. And now she's succeeding at it. It's incredible when you see somebody work for so long to be what they want and how proud they are of their career when they get it. Stephen Deschamps told me he wanted to be a pilot. He wanted to be in the Air Force when he was 16. That was his plan. That was his goal. That was his dream. And he got it. He got to be in the Air Force. And then 10 years into his career, he was pulled into an interrogation where he denied he was gay, but it didn't matter, and he was discharged. For many, many people who experience the purge, I am speaking from what we understand from many anecdotes, many stories. This is incredibly harmful to people's mental health, your safety, your security. So much relies on you having your right to work respected and to not be discriminated against in your work environment, to be treated fairly and equally and not have to fight for that so hard, and to not be denied these things. It is incredibly affecting. And because of that, many people who were purged struggled quite a bit after they were fired. It wasn't just losing a job, it was huge. For many of them, it was hiding in shame. For others, they were forcibly outed. It was difficult. And some people faced mental health effects that lasted for a long time, spiraled into other things too. And even if they didn't, this is an experience that I'm sure Purge survivors can tell you was extremely unpleasant. And it happened for thousands of people over 40 years. So what changed? Well, in the 70s, with the queer rights movement picking up steam, more and more Purge survivors started talking in the press about what they experienced. There were more queer movements, more queer organizations, more publications that would take their stories. So they started sharing and speaking out and demanding rights. And then in 1982, with the introduction of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we got Article 15, which stated that one cannot be discriminated against in Canada. And while being discriminated against because you're 2S LGBTQ plus wasn't written into the charter, quickly there were lots of court cases and challenges that included it. This is a very inclusive cause in a lot of ways. If you can back it up in the law, you cannot be discriminated against based on this thing. And so the practices that were being put forward by the RCMP, watching people, or by the Special Investigations Unit, watching people, were starting to be very heavily panned, and they started being challenged by Purge survivors in court. We have this gentleman right here. This is Wayne Davis. This is him in 1982 in his RCMP uniform. And he joined the class action of Purge survivors later on. He also, back the year that he was purged from the RCMP in 85, spoke out in front of a parliamentary committee explaining what had happened to him. And he was part of a tidal wave of people pushing back against the RCMP's practices specifically. And in 1988, the purge ended in the RCMP. But it carried on in the military for quite a long time, despite mounting legal pressure, until Michelle Douglas in 1988 was purged. And then in 1992, she challenged her firing in court under a violation of her charter rights. She had been an exemplary member of the military. She had been top of her class out of the academy. She had 2 years of excellent service behind her when all of a sudden she was pulled in and interrogated about her sexuality for 2 days without warning. And at the end, even though she denied her sexuality, she wound up being dismissed anyways. She denied her sexuality until they pushed her to take a polygraph test. It was either take a polygraph test or be iced out of her career forever. And ultimately, she decided instead of taking the polygraph test to just admit she was queer. And so she was fired. And for the next couple of years, she was a little adrift. And then she found her way to speak with Sven Robinson, one of the first openly queer politicians in Canada, first openly gay MP, and he helped support her in finding a lawyer. And in 1992, she challenged the military for her firing and succeeded. She won. And ultimately, the military settled with Douglas before the trial even began up here, and they formally ended the purge. But even though the purge was over and nobody knew was getting purged, that didn't mean that there weren't people who'd already suffered for years. Slowly, networks of survivors started to take shape. And eventually, they began the We Demand an Apology Network. They issued a press release in 2016 asking for an apology from the government of Canada. That apology was granted in 2017, but only after they began to bring a class action lawsuit to the entire government for the forced removal of queer employees for 4 decades. And they won. They did. They settled with the government, and ultimately, you see them celebrating right here. And we have Michelle here with her lawyer, celebrating with lawyer Douglas Elliott outside of court in 2018. Ultimately, the government wound up granting over $100 million to Purge survivors. I would tell you the exact figure, but numbers do not live in my mind. But it was a lot of money. And the Purge survivors worked together to set up 2 sort of funds. A good portion of the money, the bulk of it, would go to helping other survivors as they came forward to recoup what was lost with the loss of their careers. And then the rest will be set aside for education. And that's why we're here now. Part of this exhibit is funded by Purge survivors. And they helped us create this. We have interviews with Purge survivors from across Canada that are here. We have artifacts that come from their own personal collections, photos that are their own stories from all throughout their history. And the goal with this space isn't just to teach you about what happened in the past, but to teach you about how far we have to go. And it's at this point I should check my time because nobody has stopped me yet, and I still have time. No, I don't. All right, but I'm going to take a minute more to show you one last thing. If the Diefenbunker has a problem with that, they will cut me off. Right, John? Silence, so I win. Okay, cool. So I want to show you one last thing here. So this is the end of the exhibit. And this space is really cool because it has this thing behind me called scrim. And the neat thing about the scrim is it has the ability, if you press on it, to reveal what's underneath. And what's underneath here are these cool little webs that show you the various issues that still affect queer people and queer rights in Canada. Issues around law and legal representation, around queer youth and their rights, around healthcare, around political representation, around expression, and so on. And if I stop touching it, the darkness will creep in. But if I keep touching it, I can make it go away. It's hard to do by myself. That's why you always work together with friends to make a difference. But what counts is that you keep working, even when it's hard and even when it's tiring. The purge being over does not mean that we don't still have the same issues around identity, privacy, and security, around all sorts of things connected to queer rights or the rights of other discriminated groups in Canada. And this issue, all of these issues, will not go away unless we all do our part to make the darkness a little bit more banished. That is how we make a difference here. It's not about making things perfect all at once. Things will not be perfect all at once. Just like how if I'm making a change on the screen here, I can't back up and see all my good work without it going away. When you're in the thick of trying to change things and standing up for human rights, you don't often get to step back and see what impact your work will have. You have to trust that it's having it though, because what you don't see are all of the young people who are going to see what you did in the future and will appreciate it, or even better in some ways, take it for granted, because it is only by doing this work that we can create a better future. We can't change the past, but we can let the past inform our actions now to make a better tomorrow. And the first step with all of that is education, the first step. And if we're able to do all of the steps that come after, then we can really kick at the darkness and make it bleed daylight. So I want to thank you all so much for letting me show you around Love in a Dangerous Time. I know we've got some really awesome people still to come who are going to have much more personal stories and experiences. I hope that I've shared this in a way that does all of this or any of this justice. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please do feel free to ask. Thank you all so much for your time. And I'm going to pass it back to Sean.
All right. Thank you, Emily, for walking us through this exceptionally thorough and brilliantly executed exhibition to give us an overview of the Purge and its place within Canada's Cold War history. To give the personal dimension to this history, I would now like to invite Jen, Danny, and Gloria to each provide their stories within this history. And we'll start with Jen. So the floor is yours.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Jen, and I am a Purge survivor. Like I said, I grew up in the country, and after graduating high school, I enlisted in the military. Out of 4 children, 3 boys and 1 girl, I was the one, of course, that followed in father's footsteps. All I wanted to do was, I was determined to make my dad proud and do a career that I thought I wanted to do, that was going to be something that I loved to do. My goal was to be a military police. I felt it would be the perfect fit for me, and it was. Basic training was an absolute joy. I know it sounds funny. All the yelling, the drills, the discipline, it was brutal in all aspects. And with respect to the physical and mental demands, but it was horribly, it was horribly, because I was a horribly under-socialized, introverted country girl with literally no life experience. The routine, the structure, the physicality, and the challenge of having to stick to strict guidelines, it all made perfect sense to me, and I absolutely loved it. Suddenly, I found myself surrounded by women that I could finally relate to. I had found my people, and I flourished. At 21 years of age, I finally had my first real friends. When I got to Borden for my military police training, once again, I was in my element. I was in the top of my class and doing what I wanted to do. I enjoyed every minute of it. Excuse me. I was 2 weeks away from graduating from my military police training when two men came into the classroom and unceremoniously escorted me out. I was brought into a little room. Well, first I was taken into a car and driven off base to a little shack. And this room that I was taken into, it was similar to the one you just witnessed, but mine had no windows. It had a table and two chairs. And they asked me extremely intimate and uncomfortable questions about my sexual preference, my sexual experience, at which point in my life I had had absolutely none. It was both terrifying and confusing. I couldn't make any sense of what they were asking me, mainly because I didn't understand it myself. I only knew I liked girls more than boys, but what it all meant, I was completely clueless. Afterwards, I found myself in new barracks. 2 weeks later, they sent me to Ottawa for a psychological evaluation. And by the way, when I joined the class action suit in 2019, I requested my medical file. And in that file, 95% of my file was redacted, except for the results of that psychological evaluation. And there it was in big, bold print. I was diagnosed a homosexual and classified as sexual deviant. So for the next 6 months, I was in those barracks, just doing menial jobs around the base, not really knowing when or if, what was happening. I was kept in limbo. You'd ask questions you wouldn't get any answers to. So then one day the sergeant came in and he just handed me my release papers. Wow, okay, I'm free to go, but go where now? My career was ended. I had nowhere else to go but to go back and live with my parents. So naturally, they wanted to know why I was no longer in the military. And naturally, I had to lie. I told them that I had injured my back. What else could I tell them? For those first couple of months I was at home, I was completely in a daze, just going through motions. My day-to-day living had become a blur. I had no focus, no direction, and apparently no future. Then one morning the phone rang. I picked it up at the same time my mother did, and I didn't recognize the name, the voice on the phone. But that voice just said, I went through the military with your daughter. Do you know she's a lesbian? Click. And that was it. I was outed to my parents. So from that day on, my father referred to me as Butch, and my mother just kept insisting I was sick, that I needed to go and see a doctor. I was ill. Um, After another month of living at home, my parents had given me a choice. If that was the lifestyle I was going to lead, I had no family. So I quickly made the decision that I still needed to live for me. And my mother's way of thinking was, um, if you go to a doctor, they'll fix you and you won't be gay anymore. And I think it was more about her than it was about me, having three brothers and being the only daughter. So me making that choice to move out and finally um, find me, it meant that I not only lost my future with the military and my dream of being a military police, my dignity, but now I had lost my family as well. And my mother was not joking when she said, if you choose that lifestyle, you have no family. So for the next 18 years, I went from job to job, basically just going through the motions of living day to day, paycheck to paycheck, without any real direction. And during this time, I did keep minimal contact with my parents. My mother had made it very clear, do not bring your gaiety into my home. And those were her words. And her gaiety meant if I did bring somebody home for dinner with the family, we were to sit next to each other, no touching each other, don't do Google eyes, no cute names, no nothing. She didn't want to see any of it. So I never talked to anybody about anything to do with the military after I was kicked out. even my wife and my life partner now of 21 years didn't know until 2021 or 2019, sorry, when I filed the class action suit. And it was about, I'd say, a month before I filed, she was watching the fruit machine. And she says, "You really have to see this documentary." And she told me what it was and what it was about. And I said, "Oh yeah, I'll get to it one day." Um, I did get to it one day, but it was many, many years after that. But basically, for 41 years, I've been carrying around this suitcase filled with emotions: anger, shame, frustration, anxiety, worthlessness. And for the last 6 years, I have been able to, I found a great therapist. And just by chance, I ran into um, one of the Rainbow veterans, and she got me introduced to the Rainbow veterans. So, with the help of them and with a very supportive wife, I've been able to unpack some of my suitcase. But it's not been an easy road by any means. I still um, I still look over my shoulder. I look for that K car. I look for people watching me down the street, people spying on me. I don't like crowds. I don't trust people. There's so many things that we have to deal with that I had pushed and swept under the rug after I was purged. But having to open all this up, it's like opening up a new, an old wound. And I do this, I speak out because what happened to me, I don't ever want to see it happen to anybody else. What I myself and the rest of my survivor family goes through, we don't want to see anybody else have to go through this, and this is why we do this. It's therapy for us, but also it's one thing to see a movie or a documentary, but it's another thing to see somebody that's lived that experience. And if there's anything I can say to anybody watching, if you can take anything from this, is what you have heard and learned tonight, and it's what I tell everybody, is you tell somebody else, and hopefully they'll tell somebody else. It's a very dark point in our history, and it is part of our history that not a lot of people are familiar with. It's a shameful part of our history. But the more people that know about it, the more people that can be resilient and not let it happen again, because it's not something that we want to see happen again. And that's one of the reasons why we're out here telling our stories, is so that it doesn't happen again. So I thank you for inviting us, and thank you for listening. And
Thank
that's
you.
it. That's
Thank you.
it.
Thank you, Jen, for sharing your story.
That's all I got.
Danny, if you want to take the floor.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I had to modify my whole preparation after visiting the Winnipeg Museum because I haven't had a chance to. I got to see the modified at the National Arts Center last year. So anyway, I enrolled in the military in 1980, well, 79, in high school in the reserves. And then right after high school, I joined the regular force as a clerk. And I went through Cornwallis, Canadian Forces Base Borden, and then I was posted to a ship on the West Coast, HMCS Yukon. So I spent 3 years in the ship, and then I was posted to Ottawa from 84 to 88. And then I was awarded I was a pretty smart clerk, and I was posted Canadian Defence Liaison Staff in London, England, in 1990 as a master seaman. As a clerk, you're privy to a lot of information. So you log in the military police reports, you log in secret things. I had a very high security clearance. And so that will create a lot of fear as a closeted gay man. And that would lead to me being purged. So what happened was I went into the office to sign my annual evaluation report, which was above average. And then I was asked to go into my captain's office. And so I went in my captain's office and he said, Danny, shut the door. And I shut the door and I sat down. And I'm like, okay, so what's going on? And he's like, well, I can't protect you anymore. They're on to you. I knew exactly what he meant because I logged in all these reports, obviously not the ones of me. And so he said, you can have a 5F, which is a dishonorable discharge, sexual deviant, or a voluntary release, a 4C, on my desk in the morning. And if that's on my desk in the morning, then you won't disappear in a few days. So I put my voluntary release in. I spent 6 months waiting to be released. I came back to Ottawa. I released from National Defence Headquarters, and then I went as far away as I could get to Vancouver to complete my degree and come out. And then I moved to Toronto, and so 18 years passed. Things had changed in the military, I'm told. So in 2008, I got a job at Shearwater Medical Clinic, and all these people were like older than me that were re-enrolling. I was 44. And I was always open about like, why'd you get out of the military? And I said, well, either get out or get kicked out. So they said everything changed. So off I went to base Borden. All my qualifications were gone. So I went to base Borden as an ordinary seaman again. And I was top student on all my career courses again. I got posted to Halifax, where I'm from. I'm from Sydney originally, so Sydney Garrison, National Defence Headquarters, and then I was awarded another outside Canada post in Gartner, Germany. Things are going great. I get posted to Kingston. I'm a master seaman again. I call myself Master Seaman Squared because I did it twice. So in Kingston, I'm getting all these messages about the class action lawsuit and from like allies. And I'm like, wow. So I joined it. And you think everything would be great at that point, right? But that actually didn't work in my favor. It ripped a Band-Aid off of the harassment and the fear from the years before that I just shelved. I was sexually abused in a foreign port on the way to Australia, and a lot downward spiral. I just started going downhill, like really bad. Drinking lots. So anyway, I went to the medical clinic, and I met with a psychotherapist at Royal Military College. He diagnosed me with PTSD, anxiety, and depression. I was given antidepressants and sent back to work. So I fell through the cracks, and there was no follow-up. Sometimes I blame myself, and I don't think I should be blamed, but it's difficult. So I ended up in rehab in British Columbia at Edgewood. And somewhere along there, I met my person, my current husband, who is my savior. And just things just went bad. So when I got back to Kingston, I'm better now. I started feeling better. But there's still repercussions from me being absent from work. So anyway, finally my medical release comes in, and I walk out the door of the release center at CFB Kingston, and I said to myself, just let it go. And I have a tattoo here that says, let it go. And I wasn't able to get that tattoo until a couple of years ago. That was 5 years ago that I was released. And actually, I think it's like almost 3 years to the day that I was able to get this tattoo. So Today, I'm healthy and I'm happy. I live in Ottawa with my husband and my two dogs, 11 and Karen. Yes, my dog's named Karen. I volunteer with the food bank here in Canada. I volunteer with various veteran organizations like today, Canada Connect, and of course with the Rainbow Veterans of Canada, who welcomed me with open arms. And yeah, so that's my story.
Thank you for sharing your story, Danny. And then finally, Gloria, the floor is yours.
Oh, okay. Hello. So I'm Gloria. I was raised in a military family. My dad was a D-Day vet, first wave, all that stuff. My uncles, the whole family. And I had that sense that I was going to fill that tradition and keep going. And I ended up joining Navy, Royal Canadian Navy. I did well, second in my class in fleet school. Did well on deployments, did a couple of NATO deployments, and was loaned out to the German military for a while. I sailed on the German destroyers or Steuerblitzens, and did very well. Was recommended for an accelerated promotion, and in my third year, they decided to start investigating me. I'm pansexual. I cross-dress then. I'm transgender now. I've since transitioned about 13 years ago. But they didn't tell me they were investigating me. They were actually they were back in my hometown and interrogating my old friends and asking them some pretty invasive questions about my sexuality and stuff like that. And I found out. I got back from I forget which deployment I was on, but anyways, I came back and a friend of mine got a hold of me and said, "Hey, they're these guys. They said they're SIU and they're asking all this stuff about you. Are you in trouble?" And I just told, "No, it's just a security clearance." I didn't say anything because I was closeted at home too. I was pretty scared. So I knew my days were numbered. They were looking for me, and my contract was coming up. I didn't really want to leave. I was proud of my service. I did good in my service. Things were well, but I knew my time was coming. The purge was not a secret. Everybody knew it was going on. So I just, I released, I got out. The chief engineer was on HMCS Ottawa at the time. He took me aside, tried to talk me into staying. Quote, "You're a good sailor." And same with the coxswain, but I knew my time was coming. I didn't say why. I just said it wasn't for me and I had to go. And then I came home and of course had to lie again, similar to what Jen did. Just it wasn't for me, you know, peace and love, it's not my thing. And I did miss sailing though, so I pursued a career. I pursued my marine engineering and I sailed on tankers with Irving, which made it easier to hide it because I had my own cabin and my own space and stuff. So that was a little better. And I did that for years. I'd do 3 months on, 2 months off. And I worked in the theater and the entertainment industry when I wasn't sailing and pursuing engineering. Something I've always been into since I was a kid. I've always pursued. My son, when he turned 12, he absolutely had a fit. He flipped out that I was going away for Christmas and his birthday again. And one of the theaters, Imperial Theater, a theater in St. John, offered me full time as a theatrical lighting designer. So I took it, big pay drop, but it gave me time for my family. I was still quite closeted. And then I got cancer, and it was pretty bad. And going into surgery, I wasn't sure how long I had, or even if I had any time. And I just to summarize it, I just didn't want to die wondering, so I came out. And there was a price for that. I was an AV technician with a international AV outfit for 18 years. I was a senior. I trained everybody there, and they just dropped me. They didn't actually fire me. They just gave me no more shows or hours. the last time they called me in, it had been months, and they had a huge show, very difficult, lots of wireless mics around and stuff, just for me to EQ the room and then get me out of there before the client met me. So it was kind of tough, but in the theater, that dried up on me. I dropped from about 200 plus shows a year to 40 to 60. So there was a price for that. Losing that money, I split up with my ex, and my son was older at that point, and I just couldn't pay my bills, and I ended up being homeless. I lived out of my car and couch surfed and stuff with friends. Thank God I had some decent friends. And then the cancer came back with a vengeance, and I ended up hospitalized for an extended period. And finally got into some subsidized housing to get me back on my feet, and try to get working again and stuff. But it was a hell of a thing to pick up. I was just starting to walk again and starting to eat again. And I didn't have any human rights. I had no recourse for all these things that had happened that put me in this situation. I lost all my employment benefits that would have helped me. Everything just dried up on me. So I decided, well, if things aren't right, let's try to make a difference. And I started visiting my MLA and other government representatives. I can't stress it enough. It's important to know who represents you and who speaks for you. These are people from your community. Talk to them at the grocery store when you see them crossing the street, or at least try to. And I'd go in with a coffee, and my MLA, Ed Doherty was his name, and I'd just try to convince him, and can we table legislation just to bring human rights here and actually give me the same rights as everybody else, instead of losing them by transitioning. I instantly became a minority demographic. And he didn't right away. He'd get pictures with me at pride parades and drive away, and not do anything. But I kept the pressure up, but I didn't go in too hardcore. I think it's important to communicate, even with people that disagree with you. If we can stand across the street and shake our fists at each other, and it might feel good, but it doesn't help anything. It makes things more divisive. We've got to engage and talk and try to get the message across, whatever it is you're trying to convey. It took about a year. But I think it's just he had to get to know me long enough to see past this trans and just see the person. And he actually was the person. He tabled the legislation for the human rights changes in healthcare in New Brunswick. Fingers crossed. And now this sounds like this is all me. There was people just like me in the other cities in New Brunswick applying similar pressures. And it was just a case of my MLA happened to be the one that tabled the legislation, but a lot of from my prompting. And it went through all the different stages, all the readings, and ended up being enacted and came into law. And then suddenly I had human rights and recourse, and you couldn't fire me just because I was trans, and you can't just go making me homeless again. I remember the two of us when we were talking, it was just like, oh my gosh, we did it. Oh my gosh. And it was kind of mind-blowing to achieve it. They also included the healthcare with it. So I felt I had accomplished something, or at least we had. I should say we. I should always say we. It was not just me. So that was kind of nice. Though underemployment was still an issue with me. And then the cancer came back yet again, to the third time. I finally started working. One place hired me. It was the superstore, a cashier job. Big pay drop from engineering and such, but I had a job, and I was kind of working and trying to get myself saving to get out of the subsidized living, because I was surrounded by drugs and violence. It was very much slum living. And the violence came to a head. A violent schizophrenic gentleman moved next to me and somehow got a focus on me, trying to kick my door in. You fucking tranny, I'm going to kill you. Smash my vehicle, big chunks of pavement like that through my bathroom windows and things like that. Just kept happening. I called the police. They'd come, they'd have a chat with them and leave, and I just have to deal with them again. I understand that he couldn't help it. It was schizophrenia. Um, he might come up to me the next day and say, I'm so sorry for any trouble I caused. I can't help it. I have a schizophrenic condition. And I said, well, that's all right. You're fine. And then 3 hours later, he's trying to kill me. So it was a tough thing to go through. Um, it started really escalating, and I really felt I had nowhere to go. So at this time, by my choice, I became homeless again. I just put everything in storage, and I lived out of my vehicle. I kept my job. I kept myself clean, um, and just kept working at it to try to hopefully save enough to have a place to live again, to call my own. I did a lot of volunteer work for various things. I ran a fundraiser called the Empty Stocking from Here. I production managed that for many years, and different other initiatives. Um, and one of them, it was at the local Y, and I was introduced to a veterans advocate. They said, oh, there's a veterans advocate. You're a vet. You should talk to this person. I got to talk to him. He was telling me about the benefits he got and such. And I said, they didn't give me anything. I got a medal and went home. And he said, oh, no. And you get stuff. Anyways, he did all this paperwork. And it turns out I had money coming to me all that time. There was no reason for me to have ever been homeless. But better late than never. It did come in. I did do a cash out on one of them. And I bought myself a home where I'm at right now. I've reconnected with my grandchildren. They're here all the time. So it is kind of a happy ending. I never got any government recognition or anything, but it did get some community stuff. I got a Woman of Distinction Award. I got a Port City Music Award for overcoming adversity, which when they awarded me the award on the stage, they said, from here on, it's now going to be named the Gloria Dawn Award. Could you please present it in the future? Which I cried on stage. That was a bit overwhelming, but oh my gosh, what an honor. And I got a couple other, Fredericton Pride gave me a Jason Tidd Award, and a couple of other things, a wellness champion for my help with the homeless and stuff. So it kind of came around full circle, and now I'm living a fairly comfortable life. I am once again dealing with cancer again. I found out a couple of months ago, but see where it goes. If I beat it 3 times before, maybe 4 times will be no problem too. And that's pretty much my story, where I'm at right now. These days, I still do a lot of community things. I volunteer. Basically, if there's a kindred spirit with their hand out, you should take it and help them. I try to live that way and help everyone I can without hurting myself. And that's kind of my story. Thanks for listening.
All right, thank you for sharing, Gloria, and I wish you the best of luck in your fight against cancer once again. I'd like to thank Gloria, Jen, and Danny for telling your stories for this evening's event. And as a reminder for the audience, you can enter your questions for the participants named Diefenbunker or to me at Curator in the chat to ask the members of our panel a question. I have a few thoughts I just wanted to bring before we introduce questions from the audience. So, Scott, you've been sitting patiently just after we've introduced the exhibition and we've listened to the panel of survivors. So this exhibition has received a lot of positive feedback and accolades for its contextual setup and narrative of the purge. As a curator, I like to see fine details in what other institutions do for their exhibitions. What was the planning like that went into the creation of this exhibition, and what was the evolution in that process that led to the finished product we saw tonight?
Well, first of all, hi everyone, and thanks so much for the invitation to join you tonight. Emily, thanks for the great tour. That was fabulous. And of course, to the survivors for sharing your stories. It's always really moving to hear. Planning, it was extensive. It went all the way back to 2019. So I was hired in that year to curate the show. I had earned a PhD in Canadian history and the history of sexuality, but I didn't have a lot of experience with curation. We put together a really robust set of plans around oral history interviews and research and community consultation. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic hit in early 2020. and there were some leadership changes at the museum that put the development process on hold for a little bit. But once things were up and running again, we went out across the country and we conducted, oral history interviews with survivors and people who had a key role in the story of the purge and resistance to it and how it was dismantled over time. We did archival research at Library Archives Canada, the Queer Archives in Toronto, the Quebec Gay Archives in Montreal. We formed an advisory council that was made up of Purge survivors and 2S LGBTQ plus academics, educators, activists, and so on, and engaged with Two-Spirit elders and knowledge keepers from coast to coast. And this was a really community oriented experience of exhibition development. We couldn't just go to other museums or lending institutions to source objects and find images and so on. We, built deep relationships with the survivor community and the Rainbow Veterans community and others in order to populate the show with, cool keepsakes and parts of uniforms and other material that helped us to tell the story of the purge. And we also commissioned some art by queer community artists that was incorporated. So I would say that the process of planning was dynamic. It led in some kind of unanticipated directions. One of those was the art installation by Nomgonic that involved a collaboration with the Royal Winnipeg Ballet and the telling of some key chapters of the history of the purge through interpretive dance. That was not
Mm.
something that I had intended, right, when we embarked on this journey of development. Emily's putting it up on the screen right now. That's the art film that Nomgonic created with us. I didn't anticipate that we would have the ability to incorporate an oral history kiosk powered by artificial intelligence that would allow visitors to pose questions and then have key moments from oral history selected as answers to those questions. And here you can see it on Emily's screen. So, when I think back to where we were in 2019 when this whole journey began, we wound up in a different and very cool place.
Mm. That's excellent. Thank you for explaining that. And to the survivor panel, as we think about accountability, there's also a responsibility to ensure these stories aren't lost and that they inform education, policies, and legislation. So there's a two-part question I have. So what do you want future generations to understand most about the purge and your experiences? And what gives you hope when you see today's conversations around inclusion in the military, public service, and beyond?
Go ahead,
Well,
Danny.
okay, well, she's doing that because I always pass. We've only done this twice, and I passed the buck to her yesterday. Just getting back to me, but I got a really positive bomb to drop. And my husband is quite the introvert. I'm 62, retired from the military. He's 49, and next week on the 19th, he's being sworn in as a logistics officer in the Royal Canadian Air Force. And because of this, my poor introverted husband, and then I drop him off at Saint Jean on the 29th. And because of this movement, he can do that. And at 49, that's pretty brave. And stood by my side. I was a little indifferent because, my scars, but I was able to let it go. And also, I have a book that's coming out in probably December. I spent most of the year since I met with the Rainbow Veterans, and I started writing my book. So that's almost finished too. So for me, it is really important that I met the Rainbow Veterans of Canada and how it affected my family and my future. And so that's what I have to add. Off to you, Jen.
Thanks, Danny. Going on the future, I actually earlier this year I worked with the Day of Pink and did a couple of events. I did one in Kingston. Actually, I did two in Kingston, but and this was talking with some high school kids and some middle school kids, and the fact that one of the high schools that it was in Kingston, but it was 23 different high schools that they had brought into Kingston, into a movie theater where we were speaking with them. And the openness that these kids had, and the fact that they're able to express themselves and be them. And the fact that there is a book out there that's being taught from grade 10 on. I don't know if it's in all the schools or just in the Kingston area. The fact that they're starting to get this into the schools and teach these kids. Is that it there, Gloria? Yes, that's it right there. From grade 10 on, they have this book in some of the schools that they're teaching. But the fact that these kids are able to come out, ask questions, be themselves, it does give me a lot of hope for the future, and the fact that we are bringing light to what happened in the past. So these kids don't have to be in the position that we were in. They can be who they are today.
"100% agree." Really, what I think it really speaks to is that inclusion means everybody's at the table. And the purge, well, it removed people from the table, right? And that's what it is. It's about showing that this happened and that it can happen. I think it's very important not to be complacent. We've achieved human rights, we've achieved more social acceptance, but that can go backwards. All we have to do is look to our southern border and see how quickly things can overturn and become completely opposite. I think it's very important to share the stories and share the whys, and to teach our children, teach the young that there's room for everybody. There is. The basic premise of a free country is that you're free to be, do, or say anything you want, as long as you don't mess with someone else's right to be, do, or say what they want. And I'm a firm believer of it. And I think it's so important for us to ingrain that into our youth, because they're the future. It's the youth that's the future. I do have to say that I'm very enheartened by the youth today. I speak in schools, and it's very different from when I grew up. People are more tolerant, they're more open. I'll share a feel-good one. I did a workshop at the Pride in Education Summit, and it was I do different presentations. This one is one I call the art of activism, and how to engage the political process and actually make change instead of just feeling angry. And at the end of it, this youth came up to me and just asked for a hug. So I gave the kid a hug, and there was another kid looking and had that longing look, and I just said, "Come here." So I had two kids hugging, and the other kids, just everybody. And the next thing I know, I had like these 40 kids all in a group, and we're all hugging each other in this giant group hug. And that was the end of it, really, pack up and leave. But that wouldn't have happened in the 60s and 70s. It's different now. It's getting better. We've got a long ways to go. Intolerance, bigotry, racism, all of that is still alive and well, but it's a little better than it was. It's much better. We've done the legal changes. There's one thing to legislate change, but there's another thing to create social change. And for legislative change to be effective, social change must accompany it. And that's where stuff like this, these events, that cause that and reinforce it and make things a little better. I probably overtalked that.
No, no, it's fair. Thank you so much. And we do have our audience is a bit shy. We don't have any other questions that have been added into this, but I do see that Roberta Everson from the Canadian Museum for Human Rights has put in for the educators in the group the book that was just popped up. So, Love in a Dangerous Time, Canada's LGBT Purge teaching resource through the humanrights.ca guide. Um, so,
I
seeing
do
the
want
fact,
to, if I could just point out that the LGBT Purge book is part of a series. It's called Writing Canada's Wrongs, and they cover so many other things. Africville in Halifax, when they displaced the Black community. It's a series, and it covers a lot of things that Canada did wrong and made an effort to right. Sorry for that interjection.
no, it's okay. It's good. So seeing that and the fact that there's no other questions in the chat, I guess that's all the questions that we have, and seeing the time as well. So I want to thank our panel members, Emily Gartner and Scott de Groot of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, Jen Laird, Danny MacKinnon, Gloria Dawn Halvorsen of the Rainbow Veterans of Canada for working with us to put on this event. And a final reminder for those looking to learn more about this history, we encourage you to visit the Mississippi Valley Textile Museum in Almont, Ontario on Sunday, August 30th at 2 p.m. for the on-site in-person event on the history of the Purge. And I believe we have their director, Michael Wrigley-Lancaster, in the audience, who I'd like to shout out, is doing amazing work to bring more visibility to queer history in the Ottawa Valley area and has been a great collaborator to work with. Do you want to do you want to just jump in real quick, Michael, and identify yourself?
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, I'm really excited. I mean, what a privilege. It's been wonderful to work with you on this, Sean, and I'm just so excited to be a part of continuing to tell more truth of history and working with such an amazing board that I have, but also a team that I have at my museum. And so, yeah, we've got it all set that on the 30th, we're going to be doing a screening of The Fruit Machine. At 2 p.m. and it's free, but please register ahead. Please check out our website. And the Fruit Machine was done by Sarah Fode. And then survivors Patty Gray and Sharp Doppler will be joining us to speak and have a dialogue after the screening. So I very much look forward to that. And also that we have a great queer exhibition on that you can see when you're at the museum as well. That is by Lucas, and what he's put together is the Queer Newfoundland Hockey League. And so he's got this fictitious league that he's created, and it's all hand crocheted, rug hooked jerseys that he's done with this queer team. And then also his trading cards that he's made, which are images of him as each character with these works. So please enjoy. You'll enjoy that exhibition when you come as well. So please come on out. I look forward to everyone coming to our gathering.
Right, excellent. Thank you, Michael. And again, to our panel members, to learn more about this history, I highly recommend attendees to visit the website for the Rainbow Veterans of Canada. Read books, including such titles I did see in the exhibition, Canada's War on Queers, National Security as Regulation by Gary Kinsman and Patrizia Gentile. Watch films such as The Fruit Machine by Sarah Fode. Attend visiting exhibitions, including Love in a Dangerous Time by the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, which I believe will be traveling across the country. And if I'm not mistaken, the embassy in Washington will also be hosting it. And if you're in the Ottawa area, attending and supporting local Pride events, not just this month, but throughout the year as well. That concludes the event for this evening. Be sure to join us for our next talk in the Cold War Speaker Series on Thursday, September 24th, with Dr. Tim Sale of the University of Toronto. In his talk, Dr. Sale will present themes from his new book, The Next War, Indications, Intelligence, and the Early Cold War, diving into recently declassified documents to explore previously hidden history of the development of the Allied Indications Network. I want to thank you all for attending this evening's talk to learn a little more about the Cold War and how its past is still with us today. Keep an eye out for an email after this event, which will include the recording of tonight's presentation and a survey to share your feedback with us. We look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events. Thank you and take care.